All right, everyone, welcome to the All Sorts podcast. And let me tell you, today we've got a story. It's a real head scratcher. Buckle up, because we're going back to 1932 Australia. Now, you won't believe this, but the country, they actually declared war on emus.
Emus, those big flightless birds. Yeah, no, it sounds like something straight out of a cartoon, right?
But it's completely true. A full-blown military operation. And that's what we're diving deep into today. The Emu War. A moment where, well, human plans and nature's reality, they kind of collided in a spectacular way.
What grabs you right off the bat is, think about it, a government using its army, its guns against birds. What does that tell us about how much people wanted to tame the land, make it their own, and how nature sometimes pushes back in ways you'd never expect?
Exactly. And for everyone listening, this isn't just some wacky history lesson, all right? We're using all sorts of sources here. Wikipedia, old news articles, historical society records, the whole shebang. It's a deep dive into what happens when you try to settle new lands, how those ecosystems can change in crazy ways, and how sometimes nature, she just does her own thing no matter how clever we think we are.
It's all about perspective, right? Connecting this to a bigger picture for you, this Emu War, it's almost like a little microcosm of something that happens all the time. Human expansion, clashing with wildlife, makes you really think about our place in nature and the unexpected consequences of our actions.
So let's paint the scene a little bit, transport you back in time. Western Australia, early 1930s. Picture this. World War I veterans, they're given land to farm, part of this whole soldier-settler program. It was the government's way of helping them get back on their feet. The problem is, a lot of this land, it wasn't exactly the best for farming.
Yeah, and right on top of that, bam, the Great Depression hits in 1929. These farmers, they're told to grow wheat, tons of it, promised government support, subsidies. But those promises, they kind of vanished into thin air. So you got to feel for these guys, starting out with the odds stacked against them.
Imagine that for a moment, the frustration. These weren't rich, established farms. They were new, fragile, on land that was already tough to work with. And then that lifeline of financial aid, it's yanked away. Makes you wonder how they must felt facing any threat to their crops, their very livelihood.
Absolutely. Vulnerable. That's the word, isn't it?
And then enter the emus. Around 20,000 of them. Now, emus naturally move around after breeding season, heading towards the coast, that's the thing. But these farmlands, all freshly cleared with water sources for livestock, well, to the emus, it must look like a giant, delicious salad bar, especially in places like Campion, right in the heart of the wheat belt.
And here's where things get really interesting. For you, especially if you're into the whole ecology thing. See, by changing the landscape, clearing land, putting in water, humans kind of accidentally made a perfect emu habitat smack dab in the middle of their farms. You change one thing and boom, unexpected consequences.
It's like inviting guests over and then being surprised when they eat all your food. Except these guests, they weren't just nibbling, they were causing real havoc. Eating the wheat, trampling crops, ruining everything. But here's the kicker, and this is where you got to appreciate the absurdity of it all. They were also tearing holes in those rabbit-proof fences.
Oh yeah, the rabbit-proof fences. A whole other saga, right. But this shows you how one problem can make another one way worse, like a domino effect. The farmers, they weren't just losing their wheat. Now they've got even more rabbits invading, adding insult to injury. It's like when it rains, it pours.
Right. So picture this. The farmers are at their wits' end. They send this group, a deputation they called it, of ex-soldiers, their own, to the Minister of Defense, a guy named Sir George Pierce. And these veterans, thinking back to their wartime days, they come up with a solution that's, well, let's just say it's unique. They ask for machine guns to fight emus.
Machine guns. Now, that's desperation, right? It tells you just how big and scary they saw this emu problem. To them, it was like an enemy army, and they needed serious firepower to fight back.
And Pierce, get this, he agrees. But there's a catch, of course. The army guys would handle the guns, Western Australia had to pay for moving the troops, and the farmers, well, they were on the hook for food, lodging, and the ammunition. Now, why Pierce said yes, well, that's up for debate. Maybe he genuinely wanted to help, maybe it was seen as good training for the soldiers, or maybe, just maybe, it was a way to look good for Western Australia, especially with all that talk of secession going around.
It makes you wonder, doesn't it? Was it pure helpfulness, political maneuvering, or a bit of both? And here's another layer for you. They brought in a film crew from Fox Movie Tone to document the whole thing.
Oh, yeah, I can't forget the cameras. Almost like they knew this was going to be a story for the ages.
It definitely adds a whole public relations angle to it, doesn't it? Like, look, the government's taking action, but that mention of target practice, it also makes you wonder if they really grasped what they were up against.
Maybe they thought it'd be a walk in the park. Little did they know.
Okay, so November 1932 rolls around. The war, it officially begins. Leading the charge is Major Gwynedd Purves Wyn Aubrey Meredith. Try saying that 5 times fast. He's from the Royal Australian Artillery, with Sergeant S. McMurray and Gunner J. O'Halloran as his main guys. Their weapons of choice: 2 Lewis guns and a whopping 10,000 rounds of ammo. They were ready for a fight.
Armed to the teeth, eh? But nature, she's got a sense of humor, doesn't she? Because right off the bat, rain delays the whole operation. Emus scatter, and the soldiers are left twiddling their thumbs. It's like Mother Nature saying, "Hold on, boys, not so fast." A good reminder that even a military operation, it's still at the mercy of the elements. The whole thing hinged on where the emus were, how they were behaving, and that, well, that was up to the weather.
You can plan all you want, but sometimes you just gotta wait for the rain to stop.
Finally, the sky's clear, and on November 2nd, near Campion, the first shots ring out. They spot a group of about 50 emus, but they're too far away. The local farmers, they try to help, herding the birds into an ambush. But emus, as you'll soon learn, they ain't exactly sheep. They scatter, split into smaller groups, making them a nightmare to target. The initial machine gun fire, it doesn't do much. But on the second try, they manage to take down a number of birds, maybe a dozen or so. Not exactly a decisive victory.
Right away, you see the problem. Emus, they don't fight fair, do they? Their instinct is to run, scatter, making those concentrated bursts of machine gun fire pretty useless. They weren't facing a standing army, but a flurry of feathers and legs.
Then comes November 4th, the ambush at the dam. Meredith sets up his men near a watering hole, and wouldn't you know it, over 1,000 emus come marching in. This looks like their big chance. The gunners hold their fire, wait till the birds are close, then let loose. And what happens? The Lewis gun jams. After only 12 kills.
Talk about bad timing. Imagine that scene. The anticipation, the sudden chaos, and then, click, nothing. The rest of the emus, well, they obviously hightail it out of there. And that's pretty much the end of that encounter.
1,000 birds, and they only bag a dozen. You can't help but chuckle a little, can you? It's like something out of a slapstick comedy. But for the farmers, this was serious business.
It really shows you the unpredictable nature of, any kind of conflict, doesn't it? Even when your enemy isn't human. And the sheer number of emus, it just highlights the scale of the problem they were facing. This wasn't a small skirmish, it was a full-blown avian invasion.
So Meredith, he tries a new tactic. He heads south, where the emus are supposedly tamer. But even there, success eludes him. And get this, Army observers, they start noticing something peculiar. The emus, they seem to have leaders, bigger birds acting as lookouts, warning the others of danger. Who knew emus had a chain of command?
That's fascinating, isn't it? Emus, they're not just running around randomly. There's some level of intelligence there, some social structure. They're adapting, figuring out how to avoid the threat. Makes you respect them a bit, doesn't it?
It's like they're learning, evolving their tactics right in the middle of the war. Now, desperate times call for desperate measures, right? So what does Meredith do? He decides to mount a Lewis gun on a truck. Imagine that for a second. A truck chasing emus across the outback with a machine gun blazing. It's almost too absurd to be true.
I can just picture it. Dust flying, emus scattering, and this truck bouncing around like a kangaroo on a trampoline. It's the kind of image that just sticks with you, isn't it?
Yeah.
But beyond the humor, it speaks volumes about their frustration, their desperate search for a solution that worked.
But, as you might have guessed, it was a total flop. The truck couldn't keep up with the birds, and the bumpy ride meant the gunner couldn't hit a darn thing. It's like trying to hit a moving target on a roller coaster. Talk about a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, it goes to show technology isn't always the answer, especially when you're up against an enemy that's perfectly adapted to its environment. The emus, they knew that terrain like the back of their wing, I guess you could say.
By November 8th, after 6 days of this war, they'd fired a staggering 2,500 rounds. And the emu casualties, well, that's where things get a little fuzzy. One report says 50, others claim anywhere from 200 to 500. And you got to figure the farmers, they were probably leaning towards the higher numbers. Meredith, in his official report, he plays it pretty close to the chest. No human casualties, he notes, but does mention a loss of dignity. Ouch, you can practically hear the frustration in his words.
That discrepancy in the numbers, it's interesting, isn't it? Shows how hard it was to actually measure the impact of the operation. These birds, they're fast, they're tough, and knowing exactly how many were killed, well, that's a tough one. And that comment about dignity, well, I think it speaks volumes about how this whole thing was unfolding, wouldn't you say? Not exactly going according to plan.
Not exactly a shining moment for the Australian military, that's for sure. Now enter Dominic Cervanty, an ornithologist, a bird expert. He pretty much summed it up perfectly. The military's idea of just mowing down hordes of emus, well, it fell apart pretty quickly. He compared the emus' tactics to guerrilla warfare, splitting into small, agile units, making the whole military operation incredibly inefficient. Not exactly what you want when you're trying to project an image of strength and competence.
Cervanty's perspective, it's crucial, especially from a scientific standpoint. It tells you why this military approach, it just wasn't going to work. The emus, their behavior, it's evolved over millions of years to survive in the Australian outback. They're built for this. And trying to fight them with traditional military tactics, well, it was like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole.
A recipe for failure, that's for sure.
Oh,
And as you might imagine, this whole debacle, it became a hot topic back in Parliament. The newspapers, they didn't hold back either, with headlines like, "Only a few emus killed." That negative press, it ultimately led to Pierce recalling the troops and their weapons. Game over.
it's a classic case of public opinion swaying the government, right? The contrast between all that effort, all those bullets fired, and the seemingly meager results, well, it created this narrative of failure. The Emu War was quickly becoming a bit of a laughingstock.
And to add insult to injury, Meredith, after the withdrawal, he makes this amazing comparison, likening the emus to Zulu warriors. He was impressed by their ability to keep moving even when wounded. He even said that if they had a military unit with the carrying capacity of those birds, they could take on any army in the world. He went on to say that emus could face machine guns with the invulnerability of tanks. Talk about praising your opponent.
I love that quote. It's so vivid, so unexpected. And, even though he might be exaggerating a bit, it does highlight something important. Those emus, they were a tougher opponent than anyone anticipated. Comparing them to the Zulus, who were known for their fierce fighting spirit, it's a powerful image, isn't it? Those emus, they were resilient, they were adaptable, and they definitely weren't backing down.
They might not have had guns and tanks, but they had something else. Grit. Now, the story doesn't end there. The emus, well, they didn't exactly sign a peace treaty. The attacks continued, and the farmers, they were still desperate. Even the Premier of Western Australia, James Mitchell, he supported bringing back the military. And a new report surfaces, claiming 300 emus were killed in that first operation, a much higher number than initially thought.
So, the saga continues. And that revised body count, it makes you wonder, doesn't it? Was it an attempt to make the first deployment look more successful than it actually was? Or maybe they were just getting better at counting dead emus. Who knows?
Either way, the farmers weren't letting up, and neither were the emus for that matter. So, on November 12th, the Minister of Defense, he gives the green light for round 2. He even defends the decision in the Senate, saying the agricultural threat was just too serious to ignore. And guess who gets sent back in? Meredith. Because apparently, finding experienced machine gunners wasn't as easy as you might think.
That's telling, isn't it? The military, they were clearly hesitant about getting involved again, but the pressure was on. And that bit about the machine gunners, well, it suggests they weren't exactly prepared for this kind of unconventional warfare. Fighting emus, it's not exactly in the Army handbook.
So on November 13th, they're back in action. And at first, they have some success, taking down around 40 emus in just 2 days. But then, as you might have guessed, things get tricky again. The emus, they weren't about to make it easy. Still, they managed to average about 100 kills a week leading up to December 2nd. Not exactly a massacre, but progress nonetheless.
It seems they might have learned a thing or two from the first attempt, right?
Yeah.
That initial success suggests some adaptation. But the fact that the rate of kills slowed down, well, that tells you the emus were still winning the battle of attrition. They were tough, they were elusive, and they were making the soldiers work for every feather.
Finally, on December 10th, Meredith is recalled for good. His final report claims 986 confirmed kills with 9,860 rounds, fired a perfect 10 rounds per emu, and an estimated 2,500 wounded birds that likely died. Now, here's an interesting tidbit. A 1935 article in the Coolgardie Miner, it actually suggests that even though the whole machine gun thing was controversial, it did help save some of the remaining wheat crops. So maybe, just maybe, it wasn't a complete and utter failure.
Those numbers, of course, should be taken with a grain of salt. We've already seen how unreliable those estimates can be. But that point about saving the wheat, that's interesting. It offers a more nuanced perspective, doesn't it? Maybe in a limited sense, the operation did achieve something.
It might not have been the resounding victory they'd hoped for, but hey, a win's a win, right? But the story doesn't end there. The farmers, persistent as ever, they request military assistance again in 1934, 1943, and even as late as 1948. Each time, their request is denied. It seems the government had finally learned its lesson.
Those repeated requests, they're fascinating, aren't they? It shows just how much the farmers were struggling with the emus and how the military solution, well, it just wasn't a viable long-term strategy. The rejections, they signal a shift in thinking. Maybe a realization that there had to be a better way.
Thankfully, there was. The bounty system, which had been around since 1923, it continued, and you know what? It actually worked pretty well. In just 6 months in 1934, over 57,000 emu bounties were claimed. It seems a more targeted, community-based approach was far more effective than all those machine gun rounds.
Sometimes the simplest solutions are the best, right? And in this case, it seems like empowering local communities to manage the emu population, well, that proved to be a much more sustainable and successful approach.
It's a good reminder that top-down solutions don't always work. Sometimes you need to involve the people on the ground, the ones who are actually dealing with the problem day in and day out. Now, news of this Emu War, it didn't stay confined to Australia. By December 1932, word had spread all the way to the UK, and not everyone found it amusing. Conservationists, they were outraged, calling it the extermination of the rare emu. Even Australian ornithologists like Cervanty and Whittle, they described it as an attempt at the mass destruction of the birds. So there was definitely a lot of international criticism, and rightfully so.
Yeah, you can't ignore the ethical and environmental concerns, can you? It reframes the whole event, doesn't it? It's not just a quirky little story from down under. It's a reminder of how human actions can have unintended consequences for the natural world.
It's a good lesson for us all, really. And here's an interesting development. Around the same time as the Emu War, exclusion barrier fencing starts gaining popularity. It was a more practical, long-term solution for the farmers, a way to keep those pesky emus out of their crops without resorting to, well, warfare.
It's all about prevention, right? Rather than trying to eliminate the emus, they started looking at ways to manage the environment, to create boundaries that would protect the crops without harming the birds. A much more sustainable approach, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. But the emu issue, it didn't just disappear. As late as 1950, it pops up in Parliament again. A guy named Hugh Leslie, he urges the Army minister to release a bunch of .3 Wya-3 ammunition for the farmers to use, and the minister agrees to a whopping 500,000 rounds. So while the war might have been over, the conflict, in a way, it continued, just on a smaller scale.
It shows you the complexity of the issue, doesn't it? Even decades later, the emus were still a problem for the farmers, and the government, while they were still grappling with how to balance the needs of agriculture with the importance of protecting wildlife. It's a dilemma that continues to this day.
A constant balancing act, that's for sure. But beyond the practicalities, the Emu War, it's taken on a life of its own in Australian culture. It's this funny anecdote, something Australians both laugh at and maybe are a little embarrassed by.
It's become part of their national identity, hasn't it? A story they tell and retell, a way to poke fun at themselves, at the absurdity of it all. And that's how a lot of cultures deal with their history, right? Finding the humor, the irony, the lessons learned.
Absolutely. And speaking of retelling, the Emu War has even made its way into pop culture. There was a musical adaptation in Melbourne back in 2019. And get this, there's a 2023 action comedy movie called The Emu War. And if that wasn't enough, John Cleese, yes, that John Cleese, he's working on another comedy movie about it. It seems the emus, they've become unlikely movie stars.
Who would have thought, right? From military target to comedic inspiration. It speaks to the enduring power of the story, its ability to capture the imagination and make us laugh at the unexpected twists and turns of history.
And, beneath all the humor, there's a deeper layer to appreciate. Emus, they're not just comedic fodder. Ecologically, they play a crucial role in seed dispersal, especially for native plants like the quandong. And culturally, for First Nations Aboriginal peoples, the emu holds deep significance. It's featured prominently in their creation stories, representing resilience, strength, and connection to the land. It's seen as a creator spirit, a celestial being, a symbol of the very essence of Australia.
It's a beautiful reminder, isn't it? That even a creature that was once seen as a pest, a target for eradication, can hold such profound meaning, both ecologically and culturally. It speaks to the interconnectedness of all things and the importance of understanding and respecting the role that every species plays in the grand tapestry of life.
And to bring things full circle, despite the war, emus have been protected under Australian environmental law since 1999, and their populations are thriving. So, in the end, the emus, they won.
It's a testament to their resilience, their adaptability, a reminder that nature, in its own way, always finds a way to persist, to overcome the challenges we throw its way.
So, as we wrap up this wild tale of the Emu War, what are we left with? Well, for starters, a good laugh, but also a sense of awe at the tenacity of those emus, their ability to outmaneuver and outlast a military force.
It makes you think, doesn't it? How often do our attempts to control nature backfire? The Emu War, it's a perfect example of that. It's a reminder that the natural world, it operates by its own rules, and sometimes those rules, they're a lot more complex and unpredictable than we realize.
Absolutely. It's a lesson worth remembering as we continue to navigate our relationship with the environment, wouldn't you say? Now, as the echoes of this incredible true story fade, and as you carry the image of that swift, unconquerable emu in your mind, we at the All Sorts podcast invite you to continue exploring the wonderfully weird and insightful corners of our world with us. If this deep dive has sparked your curiosity, if you've enjoyed this journey into the unexpected, then we encourage you to lend us your support. Like this deep dive, share it with others who crave knowledge, who love a good story, who aren't afraid to embrace the bizarre. Subscribe to the All Sorts podcast on YouTube, where we've got a whole universe of fascinating audio waiting for you, ready to transport you to other incredible tales to make you think, to make you laugh, to make you question everything you thought you knew. And don't forget to check out our archives, a treasure trove of past explorations, each one ready to captivate and inform. Follow the All Sorts podcast across the digital landscape on X, on Instagram, on Threads. That's where the conversation continues, where we share new discoveries, where we connect with all of you amazing listeners. Your engagement, it fuels our passion and allows us to keep bringing these unique stories to life. So thank you for diving deep with us. Thank you for joining the All Sorts podcast. We'll catch you on the next adventure.
See ya then.